Today is our second last day, or our second last video. Today we're going to be looking at how and why some things float and why some things sink to the ground. We'll also be talking about how it's really important that we continue to keep up and build our relationship with God, because it's God that keeps us afloat. And we'll be talking about that a little bit today.
So to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to take a bunch of different objects that I just found laying around the house, and I'm going to put them in a bucket to see if they float or not. And you can follow along and do the same thing, whether it's in your bathtub, sink, or if you can find a bucket outside like I did. And you just want to test everyday objects, and I think it's really important to guess whether you think they will float or if they won't float. And here are some of the objects that I was able to find and that we'll be using. So the first object is a piece of wood, a shovel, a lacrosse ball, a foam plastic basketball, a hockey puck, a golf ball, marbles, and a plastic pop bottle, and a full can of pop. And those are the things that we're going to be using to test. So follow along and see how many you can get right. So the first thing we're going to do is the shovel, and the shovel sinks. Second one is the piece of firewood, and it floats. Next is the lacrosse ball, and that sinks straight to the bottom. It is interesting though that it is able to still bounce up a little bit, but eventually it just settles at the bottom. Now is the foam plastic ball, and that sits very nicely on top of the water. Now as for the hockey puck. Hockey puck sinks straight down. Yeah, nothing too interesting. The next one is the golf ball, and that one as well sinks straight to the bottom. And now we have the marbles, and these as well sink to the bottom. And second lastly, we have the plastic bottle that floats on top. And now we have the can. The can is the one that surprised me the most because it doesn't sink, but it also doesn't float. It's sort of in the middle. And to show you what's happening, I'm going to use this bigger plastic bottle. What's happening is everything everything that is filled with air is floating, and everything that's filled with water is sinking. So you just saw the pop bottle filled with nothing, and now I filled it halfway. And as you can see, just about once it settles down, about half the pop bottle is underwater, and the other half is on top. So now what do you think will happen when I fill the pop bottle all the way? So that's what I did. And as you can see, pop bottle is all the way full except for the tiny little bit at the top. And the entire pop bottle sinks except for the tiny little bit of air that's in the bottle. So this is happening because the plastic around the bottle can float, whereas the liquid water doesn't. And so if we go back to the can, this is what's happening, is that cans aren't filled all the way. So that little bit of air that's at the top of the can is floating. And that's what makes the can just sort of float along the top. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make two boats with just things that I found in my recycling. And what we're going to do is we're going to pair the two together. So for this first one, I'm going to use pop cans. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use hot glue, and I'm going to connect all these cans together to make a boat. And I'm going to see how much this boat can carry before it starts to sink. And I'm going to do that the same with plastic bottles. I'm going to see which one can hold more weight before they both start to sink. And so how I made both of these is I tried to make them both about the same size. And as you can see, I'm using hot glue to connect the two, to connect all the pieces together. This is to make sure that none of it's falling apart while it's in the water. If you're going to do this, I regularly recommend you do this at home. But just make sure that you get permission from your parents to get stuff out of the recycling. And if you're using hot glue, that you have permission from your parents to use the hot glue. So while we wait for the hot glue to dry and we watch me construct the two boats, I'm going to talk to you about the Bible for a little bit. And the story I want to talk to you about today is the story of Jesus walking on water. And this story is really important. And it connects to us because we've been looking at water and how some things float and how some things don't. And the story we're going to talk about is, like I said, Jesus walking on water. And if you've never heard this story before, that's okay. What happens in this story is Jesus is on one side of the sea with his disciples. He says, I'm going to stay behind and I'm going to pray. And he sends the disciples out into the water. His disciples listen and they go. They go out into the water and this really big storm hits. And it's this really crazy storm. And then as all the disciples are starting to feel fear and panic, they see Jesus walking on the water. And Peter, one of his disciples, he calls out and says, God, if that's you, Jesus, if that's you, like, let me walk on water too. And so Jesus says, come. And so Peter steps out of the boat and starts to walk on water towards Jesus. But because of the storm, Peter gets scared. And Peter starts to sink. And it's Jesus who picks him up and lifts him up. And the reason why Peter started to sink was because he got scared and he started to lose his trust in God. This is what's really important, is that we always remember to keep our trust in God because he's the one that keeps us afloat. And so sometimes when it feels like we're sinking, sometimes it's because we're not putting enough trust into God. This isn't just important for a relationship with God. It's also important for a relationship with other people too. Because we can be like that pop bottle that we fill up with water. When we're filled up with air and we're feeling good, it's really easy to float. But sometimes when we start to fill up with water and start to fill up with, sad things, we start to sink. That's why it's really important to do that with our friends as well. What this means is that it's really important that we are lifting up our friends and being kind to them. Because at the end of the day, that's what Jesus calls us to do. Is to not only to love him and have trust in him, but to lift each other up and to help each other out. Now that we're done both the boats, we're going to test them out and see how much they can hold. And as soon as they start to sink, that's when we're going to cut it off. So the first one we're going to test is the boat made out of pop cans. And so to do this, I'm using rocks to see how much they come on. And this one is hard to balance the rocks on top of the boat. And so part of the struggle is trying to balance all the rocks on. And I've tried multiple times, and most of the time I could only get 2 or 3 rocks to balance on the boat. The problem with the pop cans is as soon as they get to a certain point, the holes in the top start to fill up with water, and that water is bringing down the boat. And so now we're going to look at the plastic bottle boat. This boat has, some of the same problems as it's hard to balance rocks on. But I was able to balance a lot more. I do think the biggest reason of this is because the rocks didn't drop the boat low enough so that it started filling up with water. It's hard to know exactly how much weight both these boats could have held, but it was a plastic bottle boat that was able to hold a lot more.
So I hope you've enjoyed learning about why some things float, even though two objects can be the same size, and though one will sink and one will float perfectly fine. I also hope you take away learning about why it's so important to keep our relationship with God, and why it's so important to keep our trust in Him. Tomorrow, for our last video, we're going to be looking at carbonation and some of the cool things that you can do with carbonation. And for those that don't know what carbonation is what we find in drinks like pop, things like that.